and thank you for the opportunity to present today. My name is Gen Toop, and I'm here submitting on behalf of Greenpeace Aotearoa. We submit in opposition to the Regulatory Standards Bill and ask that the Select Committee reject it in its entirety. Greenpeace has operated in Aotearoa since 1974, decades before the Business Roundtable began promoting this bill. And tomorrow marks the 40th anniversary since our flagship vessel, the Rainbow Warrior, was bombed in Auckland, killing Fernando Pereira. This tragedy became a defining moment for New Zealand. In its aftermath, we stood up to global superpowers and declared ourselves nuclear-free. And in doing so, we showed the world we are a nation that defines ourselves by the values of fairness, justice, and collective responsibility to protect people and the environment. The Regulatory Standards Bill goes against all of those values, and it is our view that the bill represents an unprecedented threat to the environment. In the remainder of this oral submission, I will explain how the bill does this. But before I do, Mr. Chair, I would like to reference your maiden speech, in which you said, "We will dig deep to deliver the New Zealand our children and grandchildren deserve, the greatest country on earth and a place where hard work is rewarded." That is a positive vision, Mr. Chair, and many of us would agree with it. However, if the Regulatory Standards Bill is passed, then the digging deep that will be happening will be deep into the pockets of the public. And their tax dollars will be used not to reward hard work, but to reward wealthy multinational corporations that are polluting our water, our environment, and our climate. Clause 8C of this bill reverses the well-established principle that polluters should pay for the harm they cause, not be paid. Instead of basing laws on values of fairness and collective responsibility, this bill deliberately misuses the language of freedom and liberties as a cover for the dangerous and fringe idea that individuals and corporations are entitled to harm nature and others. And if we, through regulation, try to stop them causing that harm, then we should have to pay them compensation. The list of principles in Clause 8 of this bill elevates individualism and corporate property rights above the rights of people and nature, above the collective public interest, and the protection of the environment which sustains us. And instead of justice, which demands that the Crown honour the treaty that it signed, this list of principles in the bill does not include our founding document, and in doing so, it attempts to sideline it from future lawmaking. These principles are based on extreme ideas that I argue have no place in our democracy here in Aotearoa. Clean water, safe food, and a livable climate should never be made subservient to the so-called property rights of corporations. And I am deeply troubled that I'm having to restate the basic principle that polluters should pay, not be paid. At stake with this bill is the ability of future governments to respond to the very real crises we face: climate change, inequality, biodiversity decline, without being tied down by new bureaucratic hurdles, corporate compensation claims, and the ACT Party's rigid neoliberal ideology. I'm here representing an organisation with decades of expertise in environmental issues. In 10 minutes, I can't explain to you the myriad of ways in which humanity is utterly dependent on the environment, but I will say this: the water that comes out of your tap every day comes from the environment. And whether it is clean and safe to drink depends precisely on whether the government has done its job, regulating the activities that companies carry out using their property. The food that you eat is provided by the environment, and its production is dependent on a stable and hospitable climate. And on that front, we are swiftly running out of time. The climate is becoming more and more hostile to food production and to human life. Last week, flooding destroyed homes in Tasman. Last year, it was in Dunedin, and the year before that, it was in Auckland and Tairāwhiti. Instead of helping communities recover and adapt to these climate disasters, This bill opens the door for fossil fuel companies like Shell and ExxonMobil to demand financial compensation from the very people suffering the impacts of climate change. I would like members of this committee to consider the question, is that fair? And for those members considering voting in support of this bill, are you ready to explain to every hardworking, underpaid woman in New Zealand that this government couldn't find the money to pay equitably and fairly? How exactly is it fair that this government is considering passing a bill that puts the taxpayer on the hook for potentially billions of dollars that will be expected by these multinational polluting corporations and their offshore shareholders? If you still cannot see the deep injustice that is hardwired into this bill, or you don't believe Greenpeace when we say it represents an unprecedented threat to the environment, then I would refer you to the Ministry for the Environment's advice. The Ministry has called this bill deeply problematic. It has warned that key aspects, quote, conflict with the fundamental principles of the environmental management system, posing risks to the health, safety, economic, social and environmental interests of current and future New Zealanders, end quote. Regulatory environmental protections and climate measures are necessary, and by their design, they will conflict with the principles in this bill. They will inevitably place limits on how corporations can use their property, and they must, because it is precisely the underregulated and inappropriate use of property by companies that have created the multiple environmental crises we're facing. David Seymour claims this bill isn't enforceable in the courts, but if it passes, every future minister who wants to pass regulation that puts people's interests, the environment or the treaty first above corporate property rights, that minister will face two choices. They can either scrap the regulation or publicly justify why it defies David Seymour's ideology. The bill even creates a corporate complaints board, an unelected regulatory standards board, which will be empowered to hear and amplify the complaints of corporations and challenge laws those corporates don't like on their behalf. And this bill hands extraordinary powers to its author, David Seymour, who will decide how the principles should be applied, who should be consulted, and who sits on this unelected corporate complaints board. This is David Seymour trying to make himself the Lord of laws, to which every minister will have to answer to. And I can't understand why on earth national and New Zealand First Ministers or aspiring ministers would ever want to hand that much power to the leader of a far-right minor political party that received just 8% of the vote. By this point, you've now heard from doctors, constitutional experts, environmental scientists, Māori academics, business leaders, and multiple government departments opposing this bill. They've warned of serious impacts on New Zealanders' health, the health of our environment, Crown Māori relations, the list goes on. And any MP voting this bill through its second and third reading must at this point know that they are doing so with the full knowledge that it will be deeply damaging to Aotearoa and its people. And again, I am deeply troubled that I'm having to restate core values I thought we all held. That in a democracy, the government is supposed to serve the people, not corporations or the interests of a handful of wealthy elites. This bill is unworkable, untenable, and unwanted. I implore the Select Committee, reject it in its entirety, and instead focus on building an Aotearoa that is fair, just, and grounded in our shared responsibility to protect people and the planet and honour Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Very good. Okay, we're going to go to questions. I was going to move an extension of time when you started quoting my maiden speech. That was a good start. But I'm going to go to Andy Foster first.
Yeah, look, thank you very much for that. You particularly quoted Section 8C of the bill, and which says that legislation should not take or impair or authorise the taking or impairing of property without the consent of the owner, and then unless you compensation, etc. Just wanted to know from you what you consider impairment to being, because to my understanding, there is no property in the entire country that you can do with exactly what you like. They all have restraints on them in terms of environmental legislation, Resource Management Act, district plans, national standards, and so on. Would those, in your view, constitute impairments?
Well, Thank you for the question. I think what you've highlighted there is a core problem with this bill, that not only is property not defined, nor is impairment.
No.
And it does not outline in the bill what fair compensation is either. And in this bill, it says that David Seymour, the Minister for Regulation, will offer the guiding principles for how how the principles in this bill, including Clause 8, would be applied. So it hands a huge amount of power to one minister to decide what is property, what is the impairment of that property, and what is fair compensation.
Thank you.
Okay, no, that's good. Thank you, Andy. Tiana Tuiona.
Kia ora. Thank you, Jen, for spelling it out really, really clearly. And let me also acknowledge the anniversary of the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, which will be happening tomorrow. Ngā mihi kia koe o te rā kia koutou katoa. I was wondering if you could paint us a specific picture in a particular aspect of how this could negatively impact the environment in particular. So, for example, maybe it's mining, maybe it's ocean health, just to give the committee a specific picture of your concerns. So I agree with what you've said around the absolute dangerous nature of this bill as well. And if we had some specifics, maybe that would bring it home for some of the committee.
There's so many examples I could give you, but I will go with oil drilling, because this government has attempted to reverse the ban on deep sea oil drilling in New Zealand. And if a future government decided to regulate to prevent a catastrophic oil spill, like the one we saw with the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico, that devastated the fishing industry in that area, that devastated the environment, if the government chose to regulate to ensure a catastrophic oil spill like that did not happen in the oceans of Aotearoa, then the companies oil companies who have property here in New Zealand, whether that be an oil rig or a permit, could potentially argue that they should be compensated just for the regulation that would protect us from a catastrophic oil spill. And not only that, the minister wanting to do that regulation would have to publicly justify why it is potentially impairing the use of an oil company's property. And what we see is that this bill will cause a chilling effect on beneficial regulation that is required to address the multiple environmental crises we face.